I waited 8 years, and you walked past me like I was a stranger." Those were the words that had echoed inside my head every single day since I returned to the place my parents had always called home, even though neither of us had actually spoken them out loud. Sometimes the heart says things that the mouth never can. 8 years is a strange amount of time. It is long enough for children to become adults, for houses to fade beneath weather and silence, and for memories to become so polished that you stop remembering what truly happened and only remember how deeply they hurt. My name is Liam Carter, and until last week, I believed I would never come back to the little village tucked between rolling hills and quiet farmland where both of my parents had grown up. The only reason I returned was because my grandfather had passed away, and my mother wanted the entire family together for the memorial service. It had been nearly a decade since I had driven those narrow country roads. Every familiar landmark looked smaller than I remembered. The old grocery store still had the same faded wooden sign. The white church still stood at the center of town, with its bell tower rising above the trees. Even the diner where my father used to buy pancakes every Saturday morning still smelled like fresh coffee and warm biscuits whenever someone opened the front door. Nothing seemed to have changed, and somehow that made everything feel different. I told myself this trip would only last a few days. I would help my mother settle family matters, attend the memorial, visit my grandparents' house one last time, and then drive the 240 miles back to the city where my real life waited. That was the plan. Life, however, has never cared much about my plans. After dropping my suitcase inside the old family house, I decided to walk through the village before dinner. I needed fresh air more than conversation. The sidewalks were lined with towering oak trees, whose leaves danced gently in the summer breeze. Children rode bicycles across quiet streets, while neighbors greeted one another by name from shaded front porches. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and where leaving often meant becoming a stranger to the people who once watched you grow up. I turned a corner near the old general store without thinking. Then I stopped walking. Across the street, standing outside the flower shop with a paper bag in one hand, was Ethan Brooks. 8 years disappeared in a single heartbeat. He looked older, of course. His shoulders were broader, his hair was shorter, and there were new traces of maturity in his face, but his eyes were exactly the same. They were the eyes I had trusted with every secret I carried as a teenager. The eyes I had searched for countless times after leaving this village without ever finding them again. He looked up at almost the exact moment I noticed him. Our eyes met across the quiet street. Cars continued passing between us. Someone laughed outside the bakery. A dog barked somewhere behind me. The entire village kept moving, while time seemed to stop only for the two of us. I expected surprise. I expected confusion. Maybe even anger. Instead, Ethan simply stared at me with an expression I could not understand, one that seemed to hold years of words trapped behind a single quiet breath. Before I could convince myself to cross the street, an elderly woman stepped between us to greet Ethan. He smiled politely and helped carry one of her grocery bags toward her truck. When I looked up again only a few seconds later, he was already walking away. He never looked back. I stood there far longer than I should have, wondering why seeing him again hurt even more than losing him the first time, completely unaware that the story I had believed for 8 years was about to unravel one truth at a time. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan standing outside the flower shop exactly as he had that afternoon, looking at me with an expression that refused to leave my thoughts. I kept telling myself that seeing him had only reopened an old memory, nothing more. We were different people now. 8 years was enough time for anyone to move on. By sunrise, I had almost convinced myself that yesterday had meant nothing. Then I stepped onto the front porch of my grandparents' old house and immediately noticed something that made me stop. The flower boxes beneath the windows were full of fresh white daisies. I frowned. My grandmother had loved planting flowers there, but after she passed away, my mother always said nobody had time to maintain the garden anymore. Yet the flowers were healthy, recently watered, and surrounded by fresh mulch. I walked closer and knelt beside them. The soil was still damp from the morning. Someone had cared for them only hours earlier. Before I could think much about it, my mother opened the front door and smiled. "Breakfast is ready." During breakfast, I casually asked whether she had hired someone to take care of the property while nobody lived there. She looked surprised. "No," she answered. "Why would I?" I glanced toward the window. "The flowers outside look perfect." She turned to look before shrugging. "Maybe one of the neighbors wanted to help." It sounded reasonable enough, but something about her answer felt incomplete. After breakfast, my mother and several relatives left to meet with the pastor about the memorial service, leaving me alone in the house. I wandered from room to room, running my fingers across old family photographs, faded picture frames, and shelves filled with memories that somehow still smelled like my grandparents'. Everything remained almost exactly where I remembered it. Even the old grandfather clock continued ticking steadily in the hallway. Around noon, I stepped into the backyard. The wooden fence had recently been repaired. Dead branches had been removed from the apple tree. Fresh gravel covered the narrow path leading toward the small storage shed. I slowly turned in a circle, realizing this place had not simply survived 8 years of neglect. Someone had been preserving it. I walked into the shed expecting dust and broken tools. Instead, everything was neatly organized. Gardening gloves rested on a shelf. The lawn mower looked recently cleaned. A new package of flower seeds sat beside a watering can. None of it made sense. I finally decided to ask Mrs. Harper, the elderly woman who had lived next door for as long as I could remember. She welcomed me with the same warm smile she always had. We spent several minutes talking about my grandparents before I casually mentioned how surprised I was that the property still looked so well maintained. She smiled in a way that seemed almost knowing. "Some people just do not forget places they love," she said softly. Before I could ask what she meant, another neighbor called her name from across the street. She excused herself and promised we would talk later. Her answer stayed with me all afternoon. That evening I sat alone on the back porch watching the sunset spread across the fields behind the house. Crickets slowly filled the quiet air as memories drifted through my mind one after another. I tried convincing myself that I was imagining connections where none existed. Then I noticed something resting on the porch railing beside me. It was a small ceramic bird that had been cracked when Ethan and I accidentally knocked it over as teenagers. I remembered helping my grandfather glue it back together before placing it exactly where it still sat today. I gently picked it up and traced the repaired line with my thumb. The crack had recently been reinforced with fresh adhesive. Someone had repaired it again before it could break apart completely, and for reasons I could not explain, my heart suddenly whispered a possibility my mind was still afraid to believe. The next morning I left the house earlier than everyone else, hoping that a long walk would quiet the questions that had kept me awake for most of the night. Instead, every street seemed determined to remind me of another memory. The basketball court where Ethan had insisted he could beat me even after twisting his ankle. The tiny ice cream stand where we spent every 4th of July. The fishing dock where we once promised that no matter where life took us, we would always find our way back here. At the time, it had sounded like the kind of promise that could never be broken. Life had proved otherwise. By the time I reached the center of the village, the farmer's market had already filled the sidewalks with colorful produce, homemade pies, and friendly conversations. I wandered slowly between the booths without paying much attention to what anyone was selling. My thoughts were somewhere else entirely. I picked up a jar of local honey simply because it gave my hands something to do while my mind searched for answers that nobody had offered. Then I heard a familiar voice thanking the cashier. It was calm, steady, and unmistakable. I turned before I could stop myself. Ethan stood only a few feet away, holding a paper bag filled with fresh bread and vegetables. This time, there was no busy street separating us. No passing cars. No excuse to pretend we had not seen each other. For a brief second neither of us moved. Then Ethan offered a small, polite smile that felt almost practiced. "Liam," he said gently. Hearing my name in his voice after so many years caught me completely off guard. "It has been a long time." I forced myself to smile back. "It has." There were hundreds of questions I had imagined asking if I ever saw him again. Why did you disappear? Did you ever think about me? Did any of it matter to you? Instead, I heard myself asking the most ordinary question possible. "How have you been?" Ethan nodded once. "I have been doing well. I hope you have too." His answer was simple, careful, almost formal. It sounded like two distant acquaintances meeting by chance instead of two people who had once shared every secret they owned. We stood there surrounded by cheerful conversations from strangers while silence settled between us. Finally, I told him I had returned for my grandfather's memorial service. His expression softened immediately. "He was a wonderful man," he said. "He always treated me like family." I thanked him quietly. For a moment, it seemed as though he wanted to say something else. His lips parted slightly before he looked down at the paper bag in his hands instead. "I should let you get back to your family," he said. "Take care of yourself, Liam." Before I could answer, he turned and walked toward the parking lot. I watched him leave until he disappeared around the corner. It felt strangely unfinished, as though an entire conversation had been trapped beneath the few polite sentences we had exchanged. I released a slow breath and glanced down at the honey jar I was still holding. That was when I noticed a familiar blue scarf lying near the edge of the sidewalk. I recognized it immediately. Ethan had been wearing it only moments earlier. Without thinking, I picked it up and hurried after him, but by the time I reached the parking lot, his truck was already gone. I looked down at the scarf in my hands and realized it still carried the faint scent of cedar from the woods surrounding the village. As I folded it carefully over my arm, something small slipped from one of the pockets and landed quietly against the pavement. It was an old wooden keychain carved into the shape of an oak leaf, the exact one I had given Ethan on my 17th birthday, and I was certain he had lost it years ago. I stood there for several seconds, with the wooden keychain resting in the palm of my hand. The smooth edges had been worn down by years of being carried in someone's pocket, and the tiny oak leaf that I had carved with far more enthusiasm than skill still had my initials hidden on the back. I remembered laughing when I gave it to Ethan because I had apologized for how uneven it looked. He had smiled and told me it was the best birthday gift he had ever received because I had made it myself. I had assumed he lost it long ago. Instead, he had carried it for 8 years. I slipped the keychain back into the scarf and decided I would return both to him before I left town. That afternoon, my mother asked me to pick up a few supplies for relatives who were gathering at the house after the memorial service. I walked back toward the general store, but before I reached the entrance, I heard someone call my name. It was Mrs. Harper. She was sitting on a wooden bench beneath a large maple tree with a small paper bag resting beside her. She smiled warmly and motioned for me to join her. We talked for several minutes about my grandparents, about how much the village had changed, and about how strange it felt for me to be back after so many years. Then she looked toward my grandparents' house in the distance and quietly said, "It is nice to see someone else there again. One person should not have to take care of it forever." I looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" She tilted her head slightly, as though she had assumed everyone already knew. "I thought your mother told you." I slowly shook my head. Mrs. Harper smiled gently before continuing. Every Saturday morning, almost without fail, someone has been stopping by that house. Sometimes he mows the lawn. Sometimes he fixes broken fences. Sometimes he waters the flowers or sweeps the porch. In the winter, he clears the snow before anyone else is awake. In the fall, he rakes the leaves so they do not pile up. He has been doing it for years. My chest tightened before I even asked the question. Who? She looked at me with kind eyes that carried no surprise at all. Ethan. The world around me suddenly became very quiet. I stared at her without speaking, convinced I had misunderstood. She continued in the same calm voice. There were weekends when it rained all day. He still came. During the summer heat, he came before sunrise so the flowers would not wilt. Even after everyone assumed the house would eventually be sold, he kept showing up. Nobody asked him to. He simply said that some places deserved to be remembered. I felt as though every belief I had carried for 8 years had shifted beneath my feet. The Ethan I remembered was someone who disappeared without explanation, someone I convinced myself had chosen another life and forgotten everything we had shared. Yet the man Mrs. Harper described sounded like someone who had quietly protected a part of my family long after we were gone. Did he ever say why? I finally whispered. She smiled softly. No. But sometimes people answer questions with actions because words are not enough. Before I could ask anything else, she stood and wished me a peaceful afternoon. I remained on the bench long after she had walked away, staring toward the old house, where the flowers still bloomed beneath the windows. The scarf rested over my shoulder, the wooden keychain remained safely inside its pocket, and for the first time since returning to the village, I found myself wondering whether I had misunderstood far more than a single goodbye, because if Ethan had truly spent 8 years caring for a house that no longer belonged to him, then perhaps he had never stopped holding on to something else either. The memorial service brought nearly the entire village together the following morning. I had forgotten how small towns seemed to measure time differently, where people remembered birthdays from decades ago and greeted one another with stories instead of handshakes. After the service ended, many families stayed in the church courtyard to prepare for the annual summer festival that would begin the next evening. My mother volunteered our family to help decorate the community hall, and before I realized what was happening, I found myself carrying folding tables and boxes of lanterns alongside neighbors I had not seen since high school. For the first hour, I managed to keep my thoughts focused on simple tasks. I unfolded chairs, arranged centerpieces, and climbed a small step ladder to hang strings of white lights across the wooden beams. Then I heard someone behind me ask where the extra extension cords had been stored. I turned around and saw Ethan standing only a few feet away. He was wearing a simple navy work shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, and he looked just as surprised to find himself assigned to the same project. One of the organizers smiled without noticing the silence between us. Perfect. You two grew up together. You will probably finish this faster than anyone else. Before either of us could object, everyone else drifted toward different corners of the hall, leaving us with several unopened boxes of decorations. For a few awkward moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ethan picked up one of the boxes and gave me a small smile that felt more genuine than the one at the farmer's market. We might as well get started. I nodded and opened another box. We worked side by side in comfortable silence at first, passing ribbons, arranging tablecloths, and hanging banners across the walls. Every now and then our hands reached for the same item, followed by quiet apologies that sounded almost unnecessary. As the afternoon passed, the tension slowly softened. We even laughed when one of the paper lanterns refused to unfold properly and bounced off Ethan's shoulder before rolling across the floor. The sound of his laughter surprised me because it was exactly the way I remembered it, warm enough to make the years between us feel strangely smaller. An elderly volunteer watched us from across the room before smiling to herself. As she walked by, she casually said, "You two still make a wonderful team. Some things never really change." I felt my face grow warm, but before I could respond, Ethan simply smiled politely and thanked her for the compliment. He did not correct her. He did not distance himself. He simply continued tying another ribbon, as though her words had not embarrassed him at all. That small moment stayed with me far longer than it should have. As the afternoon came to an end, everyone began putting away supplies and sweeping the floor. I noticed Ethan gathering several empty boxes near the back entrance. Remembering the scarf, I walked over and held it out toward him. "You dropped this yesterday." He looked at the folded fabric for a long second before accepting it with careful hands. Then I reached into the pocket and handed him the small wooden oak leaf. His expression changed the instant he saw it. He stared at the keychain without speaking, gently brushing his thumb across the carved initials on the back. I expected him to laugh and say he had forgotten it was even there. Instead, he looked at me with quiet eyes and softly said, "I thought I had finally lost it." There was something in his voice that made those simple words feel much heavier than they sounded, and before I could ask why something so small still mattered after all these years, the church bell rang across the village square, while Ethan carefully slipped the oak leaf back into his pocket with the same care someone might use to protect the last remaining piece of a life they had never truly left behind. The summer festival officially began the next afternoon, and by sunset the entire village seemed transformed. Strings of warm lights stretched from one building to another, local musicians filled the square with familiar country songs, and children ran through the open lawn carrying colorful balloons that drifted against the orange evening sky. Families gathered around picnic tables covered with homemade desserts, while neighbors greeted one another as though no time had passed at all. My mother encouraged me to enjoy the festival instead of helping clean dishes, insisting that my grandparents would have wanted me to make new memories instead of spending the evening working. I wandered through the crowd with no particular destination, stopping occasionally to admire handmade crafts or listen to conversations that reminded me how different life felt here compared to the city. It was quieter, slower, and somehow more honest. I was watching a local band finish a song when Ethan appeared beside me holding 2 paper cups of fresh apple cider. He offered one to me without saying anything. I accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thank you," he nodded. "I remembered it was always your favorite." I looked down at the warm cup in my hands. I had not mentioned that preference to anyone in years. We walked together through the festival without rushing, talking about ordinary things that somehow felt important because they were shared between us. He asked about my work in the city. I asked about his job managing a nearby orchard that had belonged to his family for generations. He told me the harvest had been especially good that year. I told him I had almost forgotten what it felt like to see stars at night instead of apartment lights. Every conversation remained careful, but the distance between us continued to fade. As we reached the edge of the festival grounds, Ethan stopped walking and looked toward a quiet path leading away from the crowd. "There is somewhere I would like to show you," he said softly. I hesitated only a moment before following him. The narrow trail wound through familiar trees until we reached the old oak that overlooked the small lake beyond the village. My breath caught immediately. Even after all these years, the enormous tree still stood exactly where it always had, its wide branches stretching across the evening sky. Ethan rested one hand against the rough bark before quietly brushing away a patch of moss near the base of the trunk. Hidden beneath it were 2 sets of carved initials inside a small uneven heart. Mine and his. I remembered making them with a pocket knife when we were both 17, laughing because neither of us had any idea what we were doing. Time had weathered the carving, but it remained visible. Ethan knelt beside one of the large roots and reached into a small, weatherproof metal box tucked carefully beneath it. He opened the lid and lifted out a faded woven bracelet made from blue and white embroidery thread. I recognized it instantly because I had spent nearly an entire afternoon making it for him one summer. I had assumed it disappeared years ago. Instead, it looked carefully protected, as though someone had guarded it from every season that had passed. Ethan held it gently before looking at me with quiet honesty. "I never brought anyone else here," he said. "Some memories never felt like they belonged to anyone except us." My throat tightened as I stared at the bracelet resting in his hands. Every answer I thought I understood continued slipping away, replaced by questions that felt even more impossible to ignore. If he had kept my gifts, cared for my grandparents' house, and returned to this tree year after year without me, then the only question left was the one I had been afraid to ask since the moment I saw him again, because I no longer wondered whether he remembered me. I wondered why someone who remembered everything had ever allowed me to believe that he had forgotten. For several long moments neither of us spoke. The evening breeze moved gently through the branches above us, carrying the familiar scent of fresh grass, and the lake that had once witnessed every promise we believed would last forever. I looked at the faded bracelet in Ethan's hands before finally finding the courage to ask the question that had been growing heavier with every passing day. "If you kept all of this, then why did you let me believe you had forgotten me?" Ethan lowered his eyes, taking a slow breath that sounded as though he had been holding it for years. "Because I thought you were happier without me." I stared at him, unable to understand. "That does not make any sense." He gave a quiet smile that never reached his eyes. "It did back then." He carefully placed the bracelet back inside the small metal box before sitting against the old oak tree. After a brief hesitation, I sat beside him. Neither of us looked directly at the other. It somehow felt easier to face the lake than the truth. Ethan rested his hands together before speaking again. "The week before you left, my father collapsed while working in the orchard." I turned toward him in surprise. "Nobody told me." He nodded slowly. "Very few people knew how serious it was. The doctors believed he would recover, but they warned us that he would need constant care for a long time. My mother could not manage the orchard alone, and my older brother had already moved across the country. I became the only person who could stay." I remembered hearing vague rumors that his family had been dealing with something difficult, but I had never learned the details. Ethan continued in the same calm voice. "The morning you left, I rode my truck to your grandparents' house before sunrise. I wanted to tell you everything in person. When I arrived, your family had already gone." My heart skipped. "I waited for you." He shook his head gently. "I missed you by less than 20 minutes. I tried to picture that morning, remembering how rushed everything had felt as my parents hurried to begin our drive to the city. I had spent the entire trip staring out the window, convinced Ethan had chosen not to say goodbye. Ethan reached into the metal box once more and removed a small bundle of envelopes tied together with faded blue ribbon. "After that day, I wrote to you." He handed them to me carefully. Every envelope had my name written across the front in handwriting I recognized immediately. None had ever been opened. "I wrote every few weeks at first," he said quietly. "Then every month. I told you about my father, about the orchard, about the village, and about how much I missed you. Every letter came back marked undeliverable because your family had moved before anyone updated the address. I kept writing anyway because it was the only way I knew how to keep talking to you." My hands trembled as I held the unopened letters. Years of silence suddenly looked completely different. I had believed he never tried to reach me. The truth rested quietly in my lap, bound together with a ribbon that had faded with time. "Why did you stop?" I whispered. Ethan looked across the lake, his expression filled with a sadness I had never seen before. "I never stopped writing. I only stopped mailing them." The words settled between us with breathtaking honesty. I slowly untied the ribbon around the letters, preparing to open the first envelope, completely unaware that the greatest truth behind our years apart had still not been revealed, and that the answer I was about to receive would change the way I remembered my own family forever. My hands were shaking before I even unfolded the first letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but Ethan's handwriting remained steady and familiar, each line carrying the warmth of someone who had believed his words might someday reach me. The first letter was simple. He wrote about his father's recovery, about how strange the orchard felt without me helping during the harvest, and about how he still walked past my grandparents' house every evening because it made him feel closer to me. The second letter spoke about the first snowfall after I left. The third described the spring festival that neither of us attended together. Every page carried the same quiet hope that one day I would read them. I looked up at Ethan, unable to hide the emotion in my voice. "I never received any of these." He nodded gently. "I know." I carefully placed the letters back inside the bundle. "Then where did they go?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "I do not know. They were always returned to me. I assumed your family wanted a fresh start, and that you no longer wished to hear from anyone here." I closed my eyes for a moment. Nothing about that explanation matched the parents I thought I knew, yet something deep inside me whispered that the truth had been waiting much closer than I ever imagined. The following morning, I returned to my grandparents' house carrying the bundle of letters inside my backpack. My mother was alone in the kitchen organizing old family photographs into storage boxes. She smiled when I walked in, but her expression slowly changed after she noticed the envelopes resting in my hands. She recognized them immediately. Before I asked a single question, the color drained from her face. "Where did you get those?" she asked quietly. My heart sank. "Ethan kept every one of them." Silence filled the room. My mother lowered herself into a chair and stared at the letters for several long seconds before covering her face with trembling hands. "I hoped you would never find out," she whispered. I stood frozen beside the table. "Find out what?" Tears gathered in her eyes as she slowly looked up at me. "The first few letters reached our temporary apartment after we moved. I read one because I thought it might be important." Her voice broke. "You were devastated after leaving the village. Every day you talked about coming back. I was terrified that if you kept hearing from Ethan, you would give up the opportunities waiting for you in the city. I believed you deserved a bigger future than this small town could offer." I stared at her in complete disbelief. "So you hid them?" She nodded through quiet tears. At first, I told myself it would only be for a little while. Then more letters arrived. Every time I planned to tell you, it became harder. Eventually they stopped coming, and I convinced myself that both of you had moved on. I looked down at the bundle that had stolen 8 years from both of us. Anger tried to rise inside me, but it dissolved beneath the weight of everything we had already lost. My mother reached across the table and gently held my hand. "I never wanted to hurt either of you," she said. "I truly believed I was protecting your future." I understood that her decision had come from love, even if it had been deeply mistaken. I squeezed her hand softly before pulling her into a quiet embrace. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Some wounds could not be erased with apologies, but forgiveness had to begin somewhere. As I stepped outside a few minutes later with the letters once again in my hands, I knew there was only one place I needed to go, because after 8 years of unanswered questions, it was finally my turn to stop letting silence decide the ending of our story. That afternoon I drove to the orchard without calling ahead, because I no longer wanted another day to disappear behind hesitation. The gravel road curved between rows of apple trees that stretched across the hillside, their branches heavy with fruit waiting for the coming harvest. I spotted Ethan repairing a wooden fence near the edge of the property. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and before he could say a word, I held out the bundle of letters tied with the faded blue ribbon. His expression immediately softened. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then I quietly said, "I know what happened." He searched my face as though trying to understand what those words meant. "I talked to my mother," I continued. "She told me everything." Ethan lowered his eyes and released a slow breath. "I never wanted you to learn the truth that way." I stepped closer and gently placed the letters back into his hands. "The truth does not change what you did. You never stopped reaching for me. I was just looking in the wrong direction." His fingers tightened around the ribbon as emotion filled the silence between us. "There were so many times I almost drove to the city," he admitted. "I even packed my truck more than once. But every time I imagined showing up after so many years, I convinced myself you had built a life that no longer had room for me." I shook my head. "And I spent those same years believing you had chosen to forget me." We both laughed quietly at the painful irony of how two people could lose almost a decade simply because neither one knew the truth. The late afternoon sun settled warmly across the orchard as we slowly walked between the rows of trees. We talked for hours, not about the years we had lost, but about the lives we had lived during them. I told him about the city, my career, and the loneliness I never admitted to anyone. He told me about caring for his father until he recovered, rebuilding the orchard with his family, and visiting my grandparents' house every Saturday because leaving it alone had never felt right. There were no dramatic speeches, no impossible promises, only quiet honesty that somehow meant more than either of us could have imagined years ago. Before the sun disappeared behind the hills, Ethan stopped beside one of the oldest apple trees and looked at me with the same gentle eyes I remembered from our teenage years. "I cannot ask for the years we missed," he said softly. "But if life gives us another chance, I do not want to waste it pretending that you do not matter." I smiled through the tears I could no longer hide. "You never stopped mattering." Without another word, I reached for his hand. He hesitated only long enough to make certain I truly meant it before gently holding mine. There was no need for anything else. Some answers arrived quietly. Some endings became beginnings without anyone announcing them. 1 year later, I returned to the village again, but this time I did not pack for a weekend. I accepted a position that allowed me to work remotely and moved into my grandparents' restored house. The flower boxes beneath the windows bloomed brighter than ever. The old ceramic bird still rested safely on the porch railing, and every Saturday morning Ethan arrived carrying fresh coffee instead of working alone in the yard. Sometimes we spent the day repairing fences. Sometimes we simply sat beneath the old oak tree overlooking the lake, grateful that time had finally stopped taking things away from us. Looking back now, I realize home was never the place I had spent years trying to leave behind. Home was the person who quietly protected my memories, believed in my return even when I never came, and loved me faithfully through every season of silence until the truth finally led me back to him.